We tend to think of American history through the lens of presidential eras, right? So it's pretty easy to look in your history book or online and see, who was the president, what party, Republican or Democrat, was he from, and what was going on during that time. And the presidential office being the office where the leader of the party can enact the agenda, it makes sense why we think of American history through the lens of a presidential era, right? The New Deal era was FDR's thing. The 50s, was really helmed by Eisenhower. The 60s was chaotic because it was Nixon, and then it was LBJ. The 80s, obviously, it's iconic because of Ronald Reagan. So it's easy to organize the timeline in our heads that way. What is less understood and less talked about is what the legislature, or the House of Representatives specifically, but also the Senate, what that branch of government was doing throughout those times. What was the role of the legislature during those eras? And it's also less, talked about what the judicial branch was doing. Although it's still more talked about because of those landmark Supreme Court cases like Brown v. Board of Education or Roe v. Wade, really decades and century defining Supreme Court cases. So, your real history nerds will know about like the Warren Court and how that was like the first time like a very liberal court made all these sweeping changes. But even more obscure than that is the history of the legislature. So I'm making the case in this video. The case that I'm making right now is that you cannot deny, it is basically undeniable that the House of Representatives does not function in a modern day. It really hasn't functioned since the end of the Bush administration. So basically since 2008, it's basically not functioned. And one could also, there's a theory out there that it really hasn't functioned since the end of the Cold War. And, if you listen to people like a Peter Zeihan or other commentators or analysts, they'll say that in the post-Cold War socio-political system in the United States has not found its footing. We don't know what this era is supposed to be. We don't have a sense of what our government is supposed to do, because there was the sort of neoliberal post-history consensus after World War II, and where both parties were able to govern for a set of specific goals, even if there was conflict, between conservatives and progressives on anything from like, Jim Crow or race, other social issues, or even, the welfare state or whatever. There was still a sort of unified vision of neoliberalism, right? Free market capitalism and security throughout the Cold War against an adversary or adversaries of, China, communist China and the Soviet Union. So rewinding back, it's like a stark difference between our House of Representatives now, which gets nothing done and is like, we're on our fifth government shutdown, basically, and the way that the Congress used to function. And one of the glaring differences is that basically the House of Representatives was essentially owned by the Democrats. And so I'm making the case that just no matter what your views are, we need the Democrats to essentially run the House of Representatives in order for the country, in order for the federal government to even function at a basic level. You can have Republican presidents, and they can enact really conservative agendas, and oftentimes Democratic congressmen will even go along with it. Right, we're seeing that right now. There's Democrats in the Senate and the House that are voting, despite all their posturing, they're voting with Donald Trump's agenda They confirm conservative Supreme Court justices. Ronald Reagan had a lot of support in the Democratic Party for, a rival party, for an opposition party. He had a lot of support. George Bush had like a huge amount of support post 9/11. It's only really when Barack Obama, had his first midterm in 2010 that the Republicans really adopted the hyper-polarized position of never giving into bipartisanship. This is a great, when I was researching this topic for this video, there's a great Quora post that I just want to read aloud real quick. So they say, I'm showing my age here because they're probably a baby boomer, and baby boomers are the only people who would really remember this era. But basically, the Democrats owned the House of Representatives for decades, essentially. They also controlled a majority in the Senate more often than not. In fact, the situation, Democratic Congress, Republican president, persisted for so many years that for a while it looked like the Democrats would always control the Congress and the Republicans would always control the presidency. For a while, it looked like that might be the way things would always be. And if the Dems occasionally lost the Senate, they would at least control the House. And at the time, there seemed to be a certain logic in that. The House of Representatives was the people's house, just as the Democrats back then always claimed to be the party of the people. But more to the point, the one thing people agreed on was that they wanted the congressman for their particular city or region, their district, to do the best possible job at, quote, bringing home the bacon. The Democrats tended to do this the best because they really believed in government spending. And this obviously is like, anybody who follows politics, this rings true. This sounds very familiar. Republicans, up until recently, were always deficit hawks, talking about controlling spending, talking about scaling back Social Security, entitlements, things like that. Back to this comment. So people wanted more government spending for themselves while wanting to control government spending by everyone else. Not surprising. Therefore, people typically voted for Democratic Congress to represent their particular area, while voting for Republican presidents such as Nixon, Reagan, or Bush Sr. to control big spending generally. And they go on to say not that Reagan kept the budget deficit under control, because he didn't, which is true. But that was at least the perception. And they continue. So there is a certain logic to it. While people wanted their local congressman to be good at bringing home the bacon, they wanted a president they could imagine being a great commander-in-chief who looked like he could stand up to the Russians and Chinese. It was the Cold War, after all. For that reason, presidents such as Eisenhower, Nixon, and Reagan, who looked like they would stand up to the evil empire, tended to often win, often by landslides. And this is true. Both Eisenhower's elections were landslides. Nixon was like the biggest landslide. I think he won every state except for Minnesota. And Reagan's 1984 election was also a huge landslide. They continue. Many people felt that the bleeding heart liberals of the Democratic Party would be weak in dealing with communism. So they didn't mind having liberal Dems in Congress, but wanted a strong president to stand up to the Soviet Union. And lots of people imagined the Republicans would do better. Things have changed in part because of the end of the Cold War. Since we're accustomed to thinking about history in presidential eras, we can still look at it through that point while thinking about the makeup of the Congress, right? The party makeup of the House of Representatives. During FDR's 4-term presidency from 1933, when he took office, until he died and Truman took over, and the 80th Congress for Truman's first 2 years of his full term, the Democrats controlled both the Senate and the House of Representatives. So that's 4 terms plus Truman's first 2 years of a trifecta. That is how you get a New Deal, essentially like century defining changes in the federal government. Approaching constitutional amendment status changes, right? Social Security, Medicare, these are things that we deal with today and will likely continue for the foreseeable future. It wasn't that he was a dictator, despite what many conservatives will think or say. It's that he had 75 senators in 1940 and over 330 representatives in Congress. Same number of congressmen, by the way, total congressmen as we have now, and 100 senators. That's not just filibuster proof. That's like ironclad domination of the legislature. There's just nothing the Republicans could do because they had messed up so badly. The economy, Hoover was so unpopular, and the Democrats vastly, implemented Keynesian economics and developed a welfare state for the first time in the country's history. We keep going. So that's the foundation of this story. Then you have Truman, who became deeply unpopular, which led to, a loss of control for 2 years. And Eisenhower's first term, which he won again in a landslide because he was a very popular war hero and by objective standards was a good Republican president. He had Republican control of the Congress for his first 2 years. That was the 83rd Congress. After his first 2 years in the first midterm, this is in 1955, the 84th Congress had a Democratic. Since the 84th Congress, the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives from 1955 through the Eisenhower presidency, through the Kennedy presidency, which he barely won, through the Lyndon Johnson presidency, despite his ridiculous unpopularity at the end of the Vietnam War, through Nixon's presidency, again, despite Nixon's landslide victory, through Gerald Ford's presidency, which is pretty obvious considering that Nixon resigned after Watergate, and through Jimmy Carter's presidency, and that's not surprising. What is maybe surprising to some folks is that Ronald Reagan never, ever worked with a Republican-led House of Representatives, ever, at any point. Despite this era of being dubbed the Reagan Revolution, the Democrats never lost control of the House of Representatives. I don't think people know that. I don't think people understand that. It wasn't until after the first 2 years, so the entire time that Bush Sr. was also president. So despite the fact that Reagan was popular when he beat Jimmy Carter, won a landslide re-election victory, and then his vice president became president in 1988, the Democrats still retained control over the House of Representatives. And throughout the rest of his one-term presidency, they also did. And then, of course, Bill Clinton was popular when he was first elected. And he had a trifecta just like Obama did the first 2 years of his term. And it wasn't until the gentleman behind him, Newt Gingrich, came to be Speaker of the House in 1995 that Republicans gained control of the House. So Newt Gingrich is the first Republican Speaker of the House in 40 years. That's just like a different reality that we live in right now. And this is just, verifiable. You can look on Wikipedia. I'm looking at this house.gov history website, this archive site, where you just see the 84th Congress, 1955, Democrat control of both the House and the Senate. And you just keep going. And maybe the Republicans, took the Senate under Reagan. But from the 84th Congress all the way to 1995, the 104th Congress was the first time the Republicans took back control. It's just, and think about between those 2 years. So what happened between 1955, end of the Korean War, to we're not even the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. The entirety of the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the end of the Jim Crow era. You're talking about landmark Supreme Court cases like Brown versus Board of Education, Roe v. Wade. the free speech movement, like just like a huge amount of nation defining events happened between 1955 and 1995. And obviously, like, what does that have to do with the Congress? Well, a lot of laws got passed. And this was under both Republican and Democrat presidents. Basically, no matter what, no matter how much conflict, and there was a lot of conflict, no matter how much polarization there was, because people like to talk about how polarized our government and our society is today, it was not a cakewalk in the latter half of the 20th century in the United States. There were like, when Martin Luther King got assassinated, there were like hundreds of race riots, race riots on the same scale as the race riots we've had, in 2020. Anti-Vietnam War protests, the protests and like riot at the DNC in Chicago in 1968. A lot of conflict was happening. And yet the government did not come to a screeching halt the way it has in our modern political environment. Basically, since 2010, the House of Representatives has completely ceased to function. Well, I mean, think about that. At that time, there was no government shutdown. The government did not shut down despite the fact that Nixon was afraid that there was a mob that was going to storm the White House. The fact that Nixon resigned, the fact that Bill Clinton was impeached, the fact that LBJ had to resign, the fact that we had a presidential assassination during this time. And the government kept functioning. The kind of gridlock we have now is not because it's polarized, it's a crazy time. It's because the Republican Party is not satisfied with controlling the presidency, is not getting a president elected, is not satisfied with an overwhelming conservative Supreme Court. It developed computer-aided gerrymandering in order to take the House of Representatives away from the Democrats. That's what it is. Our country, no matter if you're a conservative or if you're a liberal, I happen to be a progressive left person, the country can move forward, can function with the Republicans in the Senate. It can function with a Republican president. Even if I don't want that to be the case, it still functions. It really just seems like the country just does not function if the Republican Party has control of the House of Representatives. That's the case I'm making. That is the case that I'm making. And, that person on Quora made the case that it was a different era because of the Cold War. And I think that's partly true. I think another reason why that could be true is actually I found another post on Quora that has an alternative view that I want to discuss. And this one's a little more critical. So this person says, so how did the Democrats retain control of Congress for so much of the 20th century? I guess you could say that the main reason that Democrats were successful for that time was that the party didn't really stand for anything. In the South, it was the party of Jim Crow and had a complete lock on nearly every office for decades. After civil rights caused most Southerners to change to Republicans, most segregationists who had been first elected as Democrats stayed in the party because seniority rules would have penalized them for changing parties. This is what people call as the Southern Dixiecrats. At the same time, Democrats in the rest of the country were mostly fairly liberal. Although for the period we're discussing here, many Republicans were also quite liberal. So you had, less polarization between the parties, liberal Republicans and liberal Democrats, conservative Republicans. They go on. In effect, both parties were very odd coalitions with hardly any ideological consistency. A lot of people were very critical of that at the time. But in an era where both parties really do have a lot of ideological distinctiveness, we're discovering that the old system contributed to successful governance in ways nobody really understood at the time. Now the term rhino and dino, mostly rhino, get thrown away, throw around, because there's no room for moderation within the Republican Party. And I would say that's just not true for the Democrats to the same degree. The essential reason that the Democrats held congressional majorities for most of that time was that since they held essentially every seat in the South, with only about 40% of the rest of the seats, Democrats could put together a majority. And Democrats could compete in almost every district because they could always be whatever they needed to be to compete wherever they were. Finally, between two candidates who tend to be pretty similar, since Republican also could be whatever they need to be at any given locality, it often made more sense to go with the Democrats, since Democrats, as the majority party, held more power. And a member of the majority could usually get more done to support local interests. And that's how this theory overlaps with the other theory. And I think both of them are correct to some degree, right? I think this answer here about Southern Democrats and about the country being a big tent party, which it is to this day, and the fact that they don't really stand for anything, which I think is to a degree true to this day, really explains a lot. And the other answer about the psychology of the voter also explains a lot. And it's kind of funny. It's like I'm making the case that we should be nostalgic for this time. The fact is, if both parties were as big tent and ideologically diverse, and that's a nice way of putting it, as the Democrats, if the Republicans were also as ideologically diverse, our government would function better. It just would function better, And maybe people would think, well, what's the point of it functioning better? Like, who cares if the institution runs well, if everyday life for Americans is getting worse? There's no point, right? And I just think that, those things go hand in hand. Like, things are getting worse because of the failing of the institutions. The institutions are failing because they're not delivering for the people. And while the Democrats may have stood for nothing on paper, they still delivered legislation for people, right? Whether it was, from a conservative standpoint or from a liberal progressive standpoint, the fact is, like, we can't even get anything done. And I'm essentially making the case that we need to get rid of gerrymandering. We need to, make it so that Democrats gain control of the House of Representatives and they get to keep it. I think they just need to get to keep it, basically. And this is still how it needs to be. So I started thinking about this because I read a New York Times article about switching to a multi-party system. And, I think I'll cover that in another video. But yeah, essentially, I think we did have a multi-party system within the two-party system. And so, some form of getting back to that needs to happen. And I think, I don't see the Republican Party really diversifying its membership or its, the spread of ideology within that party. I only see them losing to the Democrats, who then would have that sort of big tent intact. So obviously that's not the reality that we're going to go into. The Republicans are going to have a narrow majority in the House for Donald Trump's first term. I expect that they will lose control of the House in 2026, and we'll see what happens after that.